Great. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully this is working. I think it's working. So this is last but certainly not least. As we know, funders have a critical role to play in implementation science, getting evidence used, getting the right evidence produced, shaping a lot of the incentives. Now, obviously, keeping in mind that governments are kind of the main drivers of the change that we're after, but funders have a critical role to play. So today we're going to hear from a bunch of folks from different hats who have different funding perspectives, from bilaterals, multilaterals, foundations, and so we'll hear from them. So the first question, and we'll have actually a lot of time for Q&A. The first question is, what are concrete mechanisms your organization, either currently or past, or maybe an organization you hold dear, but you can pick from those, your organization has used to facilitate evidence uptake, and can you give us some specific examples? So Heta, we'll start with you.
Oh, all right. You were, Christine made me scooch over. I guess we weren't going to go in order. So my name's Hethel Tukral. I'm the Evidence and Learning Division Lead in the Center for Education at USAID. And I just want to make a reflection, because that's part of my answer. I think we've talked a lot about the unit of analysis here today as the interventions. And I think one thing to highlight with USAID's approach, it's really the unit of analysis that we're thinking of are the people. I think all of the work here, right, the center at the end of the day is that interaction between the teacher and the student. And how do we influence that in all the different ways? So one thing that I would, I'll maybe start with my homework also for the What Works Hub, is potentially thinking of what works for whom as the hub. A lot of what we focus on is around inclusion, children with disabilities, right? So I would really encourage all the researchers to think of how do we unpack and disaggregate the data so that we know that this is working, but not just for some children. So for some concrete things that we're working on is, I'll bucket in three things. So what is the evidence for, or who is the evidence for, right? Who are the decision makers we're trying to influence? And I know we have Rebecca and Tomas and Amy in the room. They are our team doing the decode activity, which is intended to really understand who are the users, how do they engage with evidence, what are the preparedness and skills and capacity they need, so that whatever evidence comes in front of them, that they're able to really engage with it and answer the questions that they have. Another area is just really around meta standards. So how do we have a common taxonomy for all the evidence and the research, so that when it goes out there, it's not different depending on who has funded it and who has provided it or done it. Evidence translation is a real job. I think that's another thing we really want to focus on, is we ask data people to talk policy and we ask policy people to talk data. And there's a real job in the middle that I think we really just need to make concrete and say it has real skills and it needs its own support, so that they can be those interlocutors and really support all the decision makers. The second bucket is, who is the evidence of? So that's where I really want to emphasize, like, there's a lot of focus on evidence for children who are deaf, children who have disabilities of all kinds. Inclusion, we've committed to the universal design for learning for all of our materials, abiding by the universal design for learning by 2026. So how do we do that? And sometimes that's at odds with having, with demonstrating that it's effective kind of on the average. And the last bucket is what evidence actually matters. So we do consider a range of outcomes, learning outcomes, social emotional learning, motivation, capacity, strengthening. So how do we make sure all of those are outcomes that we can actually make sure that the interventions and the activities do support?
Great, thank you. Christine.
Okay, terrific, thanks. I have two examples I want to share, one from my time at USAID, and then another from the time leading global research and evidence for Room to Read, which is a very large international nonprofit working in literacy and girls' education. And I think from USAID, one of the processes we went through is early in the days when we were investing in a lot of impact evaluations and a lot of evidence and increasing that investment, but we still had kind of questions about how do we think about the strength of that evidence, how do we think about the strength of those findings and use them in our designs. And one of the things we moved through was, and actually using at that time some initial DFID guidance and collaborating with BE Squared, to come up with kind of like an assessing strength of evidence, rubric, right? So how do we think about this beyond like, just the RCTs and well-powered RCTs and all of that? And so one of the things that came out of that, though, was a very participatory exercise. It was long, messy, painful. It took a lot of people's time, but a very participatory exercise to actually go through and actually use those rubrics and assess the strength of the evidence. But through that process, right, you're actually engaging with the findings in a deeper way than you would if you're like sitting and kind of, we still had our communities of practice and our presentations on findings and things like that. But like finding entry points for consumers, or people who are supposed to be understanding the findings and taking it up, to engage from different lenses and understand it a bit better, I think really worked for us. And there were dozens and dozens of people involved in that process. And not only did it help us understand kind of the quality and the nature of the evidence we were funding, but I think it also really helped people internalize the findings. And then just a second related to the work you guys are doing from an implementing partner perspective, one of the best experiences that we had at Room to Read, like large portfolio working over 20 countries, 9 country offices with M&E, my global team, a lot of implementing data, very thoughtful and a lot of investments in data and evaluations, but getting a grant, we got a science of teaching grant to look at assessment-informed instruction. And we had been implementing an assessment-informed instruction model, like census-based student assessments and teacher adaptations and coaching, right? That kind of like whole process for about 8 years in thousands and thousands of schools. And we had good implementation monitoring data on it. We looked at like coaching frequency and we looked at what the student learning data was saying. But that science of teaching grant, and it wasn't called that, but it was an implementation research grant, right? Allowed us to, as an organization, to say, okay, we had funding, we had time, we had accountability for research reports, which helps. Allowed us to look systematically at all of that implementation monitoring data in a different way. And then we added data, right? We went and did data collection with our field teams and stuff. And it was just such a profound experience of both using data we already had in ways we hadn't, but also engaging our teams and then feeding back to like the global design. So the IR is just a shout out to this, right, like process and the structure of funding research that's not necessarily the programs you're funding, but helping, So that to me was a good example of evidence uptake.
Great, thank you. Nathaniel.
Thanks. So, I think the thing that I wanted just to start with is, so I head up the What Works Research Department in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, is that we've deliberately set a mission and a goal around the uptake of research. So the UK as a whole is a large funder of R&D. In FCDO, we've made an explicit decision to if you like, for our measure of success to be uptake of R&D. Now, that sounds easy, but actually it's quite a specific choice because there's lots of other ends of R&D, particularly funded in other bits of UK government, that don't take that approach, which is also really important, which is just to fund early stage science for science sake. And if you look at a lot of the progress in human development, it has come at that end. And so in a sense, we've sort of picked the harder end, but being clear that that's a measure of success drives everything else. So some of those things are quite difficult. I'm sure lots of people in this room have been a victim of our constant requests to demonstrate examples of impact. And all of the practical things like our annual reviews, which seem quite bureaucratic and painful, but they all lead back to that mission, which is that we are here to fund R&D only if it contributes to poverty reduction in all of the sectors that we work in. So I think that setting that mission and goal up front is important. I want to talk a little bit about internally in FCDO. I think we do invest a lot in evidence generation. I just think increasingly there's just not enough focus on the kind of policy and uptake side, and I mean that internally within FCDO and in the partner governments that we try to work with, who want evidence from us. And so I just wanted to say a little bit about that end. It's not because I don't think I think the generation bit is critical and it's a clearly foundational block. I just think we're much better at it. Collectively, I mean, people working on this. So I think on the uptake side, I think it's about incentives. And internally, we have tried to put a lot of incentives in. So that is around, you can't have a business case approved unless it has evidence in it. You can't get funding unless you're able to demonstrate the evidence of what you're proposing. But I think if we're honest, we've all seen business cases where the evidence that is used to confirm a prior position. And I think where we need to move to next is thinking through much greater transparency globally in policy and practice. So I actually think we hold researchers in some senses to more account for getting their research used than we do on the policy side. And I just think that's the wrong way around. Yeah.
Thank you. Linda.
Yeah, hi, I'm Linda Jones. I lead the UNICEF education research based in our Innocenti office in Florence. I'm based there. Very few of the team are based there. Most of them are out in the countries where the research is actually happening. I think if I look at UNICEF and the way we operate, we are heavily decentralized. The decisions of the work we do with governments and the work plans that get agreed for each year are done at country level. And many of you may have country level teams who have engaged in those discussions and negotiations on what will happen. The beauty of those offices having existed there a long time reflects some of the conversations that happened yesterday and today on the need for trust between the right people in the room, and also the understanding of what else is going on and how things fit in with the larger situation. So quite a lot of our research is driven by key moments that is known to be coming up, whether that be a new education sector plan, or whether that be a new grant that will be applied for a particular education learning improvement program, or a GPE grant. So for instance, many of you will have heard of the Data Must Speak, which is a positive deviance approach in research. I love it. I absolutely love reading the reports, which are so positive, and they work very well as well with our government partners and other partners. So when you find out what's working in schools, naturally, without big programs, it starts from the administrative data. Then governments can make decisions on things that they can focus on and do a bit better with these new grants that might be coming in. So for instance, in one country, one of the behaviors that was happening was teachers would more regularly check in on the children's understanding of what was being taught in the classroom. That was happening more regularly. And then when it came to what we call the stage 4, where people look around and go, okay, what are the enablers for that to happen? It was realized that there wasn't much guidance given to teachers on formative assessments. So a very simple decision on better tools and support for teachers on formative assessments in the classrooms was one of the things that came out of that. It's quite simple, not a huge thing to invest in, but from our positive deviance, one of the factors on better learning happening in the classroom. I have to say as well, because of the relationships, the similar with the Ed Labs, it does mean that we're building right from the beginning. The Ministry of Education, the local education actors are involved not only in the design of the research or the approval of the research, but at every stage of the research. And that matters as well, that how you go about it, what your questions, who is asking the questions and why. These are all things that when the researchers group together and have discussions on what's going on where, these are the types of discussions they have on what's really working.
Thank you. Danica.
Great. Hi everyone. So I'm Danica Dymowska, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Jacobs Foundation. So let me start by saying that something that maybe will sound very strange for a research funder. We've been around for 30 years and we have been funding kind of foundational research on how children learn. Many of you have come up to me and asked about a fellowship. That's what the foundation's known for, kind of funding mid-career researchers who are interested in learning about how children learn. So we have this interdisciplinary fellowship with lots of people, some of whom are not here because they're in a very different type of discipline, like neuroscientists and behavioral geneticists and all kinds of people like that. So that's where we came from. That's our kind of genesis. That's the beginning of the foundation's reason for existing. However, we've kind of questioned that reason over the last few years of, is that really where we need to be in terms of the full portfolio of work that we do? And the answer is no. That's one part, similar to what Nathaniel was saying. That's one part of the puzzle. And we've started to work more at the country level, starting with Côte d'Ivoire, now Ghana, Switzerland, and Colombia. And the idea there is that what we want to do is to build the knowledge at a global level about how children learn and get to the uptake, which is happening at the country level. So what we're funding there is the ed labs. This is the big bet, these education evidence labs that are what we see them as the clearinghouse of evidence. So all the research that we saw and heard about today, in an ideal world, that would be the clearinghouse at the country level that makes sense of it all. So we're trying to defragment at a country level how research actually happens. So it's a pretty ambitious set of things that we're trying to do. But the one thing I wanted to emphasize to answer your question, Noam, is that I think what we're trying to flip to is the script. We keep talking about evidence-based policy. I think what we want to do is policy-based evidence. Because these entities, the ed labs, are political entities. And that, to me, did not come out very clearly. We're talking about political things, not evidence institutes or, the purity of research is one thing. Informing how policy happens and the messiness of that is another. We all know that. So what we're trying to do is understand the process of how policy happens too. So the global, the ed lab, but then what we're attempting to do as well is understand the messiness of how that translation, what you call the uptake piece, happens. And I think that's where we need to complete that last mile. It feels like that's a piece that we have not yet tackled as a community. I mean, we're not the only ones that are looking at this. But how do we get to that last mile? Not just uptake, yes, got it, that research got taken up and policy happened. But as a science at uptake, that's missing still.
It's clear everyone wants us to move out of that efficacy bubble and into these other bubbles. So that point is loud and clear, I think, from all of the panelists and the various mechanisms to do that. And I think another thing that's come through clearly, I think sometimes we think about evidence as kind of a single slice, sort of like a study. But I think all the panelists have spoken to processes, kind of evidence processes and investing in that. And I've kind of taken to embracing the stock market as an analogy, for better or worse, where it's kind of moving up and down and up and down. And if you ever took one slice, it would be quite misleading. And you kind of have to embrace the downs. But as long as the trend goes up, you're okay. Maybe, I don't know if people like that analogy or not, but I've been using that. Yes, yeah, exactly. Hopefully it doesn't crash, exactly. But I think we're hearing a lot about evidence processes and systems to support that. Okay, so one more question for me, and then we'll open up to the audience. What type of evidence have you seen be taken up most? And if you can give us specific examples. Maybe we'll go in reverse order. So Danica, starting with you.
I found my question to be really difficult, to be honest with you, because I don't know if we necessarily have a really good collective answer to that. And that's what I mean by that last mile of what kind of evidence get taken up. The honest answer is that not good. Not good evidence gets taken. And the reason for that, I say, is that if you look at how governments make decisions, and I'm talking about all governments because we work in high resource settings as well, it's very anecdotal. It's very, what I heard my, colleague say, or my cousin, or my nephew, or whoever, it's that, that is still the norm of what kind of evidence informs policy. So I'm not dodging your question. I think I'm just recognizing the reality of the kinds of things that happen and how decisions are made. What I would say with the ideal kind of evidence would be is the efficacy plus thing that you're talking about, with a much more well-designed, systematic process of building off of a global knowledge base rather than individual studies, whether RCTs or not. And that's missing as well. So I couldn't answer your question of what kind of evidence gets taken up, because I haven't yet seen that systematic process of embedding happen in a very well organized way. So that's the question and the challenge to all of you, is how do we move beyond the individual studies to the collective knowledge base and to that being taken up in a systematic way.
Linda?
Yeah, I think building on that, I should fess up, most of my career has been at country level as a practitioner, working with ministries of education, government, with UNICEF, but also in ministries of education directly on program side, implementing. And it's really true. There's pressure to deliver, pressure to be better, and governments will move fast as they possibly can. And if the best evidence isn't helping them move forward effectively in their minds or in the public mind, it could possibly be completely ignored. So it's not necessarily about what evidence. It is again about who are the people who make the difference for the best evidence to be taken up. Are they in the room? Are they part of the discussion? Is the Minister of Finance understanding what the investment in this could have on the economy in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? Is the District Education Officer understanding exactly what this will mean for them? Do they see it as more work? Has effort been put in to actually do things to really take the stress away from teachers? Change is scary. We have in this country alone massive reforms where we've lost teacher workforce. So all of those things, you just need pushback from a very large part of the education community for things not to work. So I don't think it's about what the evidence is. I think it goes back to the process, how well you're looking at who the people are that need to be in the conversation.
Nathaniel?
Yeah, so disappointing, I'm going to agree. I mean, I was trying to find some way of disagreeing just to make the panel a bit more live. But I think, yeah, look, the evidence that gets taken up most is the evidence that supports the chosen course of action that's already underway. I think it's just there's lots of evidence to support the idea that it's much harder to change someone's mind than it is to support them. I do think though that doesn't mean that we're all lost, right? And anyway, I think I would agree that really the question is about how do we get decision making to be more transparent. I mean, it's just not the case that it would be a desirable outcome for all policy to be solely based on evidence, because then you wouldn't need elections and democracies. You could just make all the decisions based on evidence. It is the case that, in my view, it's better that elected officials make those choices, but they should be required to say how they've made those choices and say whether they've ignored evidence or not. And so I think that should be the goal rather than the uptake of a particular piece of evidence or not. And that's what I mean about the transparency of the process and the transparency of the policy process being the important goal. But I would say, I think, I don't know how many governance experts are around the room, but really this is like the classic governance problem, right? It's like, how do you make decisions? How do you reform institutions? I'm not sure we draw enough on that kind of thinking and working politically. When I've seen it work really well, I think the smart buys is a great example, right? So the smart buys in Kenya was a nice alignment of the Kenyan government saying we've got a large education expenditure. We would like some support and help in thinking through reform. We're up for reform. And the smart buys being available at the right time to be able to help identify in a way that I think was very clear, specific, digestible for policymakers. The last thing I'll just say is there's a bit of a plug for the What Works Hub, but I think is how we kind of wire some of the hard incentives into programming, which are about money. So I think, where I think you have joint research funding and joint policy money, which, in a sort of boring technical way is like two different budgets and can't be spent on the same thing. But if they've both got a top line goal, which is about improving learning outcomes, it's a great way of getting that evidence taken up because it's already part of a policy process.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to Donica's original point. When you kind of look at the patterns, what seems to happen most of the time, at least from the experience I've had working at the country level and the policy level, is that it does feel quite kind of random and a little episodic. But I would like to add to that it's also what's making the rounds, right? We all know what we're talking about. Like, right, you have these cycles of kind of, I call it like what's trending on, in the education sector, almost like trending on Twitter, right? You go through these cycles of what's kind of like the in vogue or the thing that everybody's speaking about makes it into the World Bank country, review decks and the What Works Hub, stuff and the GEEP report and all of that. So I think that has an outsized presence, ends up having an outside because it's usually kind of concise and clear and, simple and high level enough that people can kind of understand what it is. And so I think that has an enormous amount of influence, whether it should or not. I think that to go back to some of these points as well, when I think evidence that is meaningful and important to that policy does get taken up, it is a combination of timing, right? And some of that's luck. I have a specific example on that. I was working on a project and I was leading the research for a national level early grade reading program, and we wanted to do an instructional time study. And we're working on a research agenda definitions and things like that with the different parts of the ministry and not really getting anywhere on any agenda items and kind of focus for the research investments. And so I did this beautiful 20 slide deck on this instructional study purpose and design and what it would look like, what it could tell them. And we had a meeting. The bank had just been there to do a sector review the week before, and they brought the SDI data, right, that the bank did in terms of regional instructional time loss in general. And the minister had seen that, the DG had seen that. And so I sit down and he opens the first slide and sees instructional time. And the bank has just told him the week before, we have a crisis in instructional time. And so I'm like ready to okay, let me tell you about the design and rationale. He's like, done, we're good, we're go. It's just so it underscored to me the timing, the luck, and of course there is some coherence in the messages, globally. I'm not saying it's always a bad thing. Instructional time is an issue, right? It's a good thing that it's making the rounds. But I do think it's that. I also think the evidence that actually facilitates uptake is very tailored, right? And that there's trust around it. So you go through processes beyond just study reference groups, beyond design workshops where, you get the ministry people in the field, they're piloting an observation instrument, you're having preliminary findings workshops and not just kind of ultimate recommendation workshops. But it takes time, and there's so few projects that have the flexibility and the funding and the continuity, right, to do that. So I think there's some structural issues there, but that's where I've seen it work well, where there's evidence that's very tailored and that's really appropriate to be taken up. But,
I think the evidence that gets taken up is the evidence that the person has in that moment. We did an evidence use study And what we found is the word evidence is also not collectively understood in one way. Data, qualitative, quantitative. I went to a site visit. Here's what I saw. This person told me this is what they think. I'm going to write it into my design. So when we ask about evidence, people they're using evidence. It's just we don't have a collective and shared definition of what that is. And I don't think the point is to correct anyone or to change it, but to say there's different kinds of evidence, and depending on the stakes at hand, the decision, your choice of evidence should be appropriate. So what I think part of the solutioning here is coming up with that common understanding, but also not discounting that all this other experiential tacit knowledge does very much have a place. And a lot of times, that's actually where you might need to start, right? You're going to find a common place with someone who is like a minister or a DG saying, I just went to a school and this is what I saw. Great. Yes, let's start there. That is real knowledge. That is evidence. And now how do I walk with you to these other pieces of evidence that can maybe point us in a different direction? So I think really just whatever people have at time, and I think the timeliness is a really important piece. I hope all the research here is, available and accessible for years and people come back to it. But what if it's not in the right person's hand at the right time? They're not going to act on this amazing research in their work.
I mean, I'm envisioning a Venn diagram of is it good and is it wanted? And it sounds like the panel is a little bit pessimistic and that the intersection is maybe smaller than we might hope. But maybe we can try to expand it over the course of the hub. And maybe actually one thing that comes to mind is menu-based approaches. So it's not like this thing is the thing that works. It's like here's 5 things or 10 things with various degrees of confidence or various types of typologies. And then it's a matchmaking, and maybe that expands that intersection a little bit. Okay, let's open up to the audience. Yes, Kristen. And then let's see if more hands so we can direct folks. Yeah.
Chris Thomas from the Prize Foundation.
Okay, we have to get a functioning mic over there. And then if someone can pass a mic back there as well in the meantime. Yeah.
So Chris Thomas from the Prize Foundation. Danica, you mentioned building these evidence banks. And I guess my question to the panel is, where do you do your banking? there's and I don't mean to be glib, but there's a proliferation of institutions now, sources of information, universities, think tanks, consulting firms, international organizations, NGOs. And it's genuinely confusing for policymakers or a teacher to say, I've got this question, I want to answer this question. Where do I go? What's your go-to institutions? Why? And to Noam, I guess my question is, how are you thinking about building the What Works Hub into that go-to institution? What are the characteristics you want to develop here that would make policymakers want to come to you?
Great, thank you. Yes, let's get some more questions. Yeah, feel free to go right there. Yeah, if that works. And then we mic in the back there.
Yeah,
also.
I think. Anushka, I'm from Blavatnik School of Government. I guess one of the things I've been thinking about when you say you're working with governments and you're working with local country partners is that how do you ensure uptake by last mile implementers? So teachers, how do you ensure that they buy into the evidence?
Can we get a mic over there? Or is that too far to run? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Yeah, the other side.
Hi, my name is Clara from OTT. My question is to Nathaniel. Hi, how are you? If I'm not mistaken, you've been involved in this sector since BCure or even before then. BCure was a program funded by DFID on building capacity for the use of research evidence. And it's been 10 years since that. So I wanted to take your view on how the sector has evolved, the conversation has evolved, hopefully, or changed at least. Thank you.
Maybe let's get one more. I think I saw a hand over there. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks. This question maybe is for Danica, but for the panel more broadly. I wonder if the question, based on your helpful comments, is more one of how do political decisions for a given policy alternative get made rather than how do we ensure that evidence gets taken up. This has been a helpful frame shift for me, and I'll credit my friend here, Penelope Bender, who put me onto the work of Jeremy Schiffman, who talks about the generation of political priorities applied to these types of contexts, where evidence is one piece of about 20 possible factors that shape politics.
Great. Okay, maybe is there any other burning? Okay, we can bring back to the panel and then we can come back out. So maybe Donica, we'll start with you. Yeah. Yeah. Does it work?
Maybe just picking up on Chris, it's setting me up perfectly because your question is one that we've been grappling with a lot of. And I would just say a couple of words and others may want to react to that. I think that there is we as funders have been guilty of funding that cottage industry of platforms and evidence repositories. And we call them the graveyard of things that funders have funded over the years. And we, supported by Google, yeah. And by the way, and the question was, are any of them better than Google or ChatGPT? No, probably not. So I think that there is a conversation, ongoing conversation. You weren't here on Tuesday where we used the piping, plumbing of the architecture. There's probably a better analogy out there, but how do we create the back end of the system so that we can develop a better front end without creating the front end of them all? But every one of these ed labs might be able to pull from that back end of metadata and the way that we're categorizing and taxonomies and whatnot. And that would be the thing that is a bigger contribution than creating the evidence database to rule them all. Maybe that's what, I don't think Noam and the team here want to do that, but I do think the experience shows that that's probably not going to be the way forward. And it's a more sophisticated way of thinking that we need to bring into this. But the conversations are ongoing, so I do think that that's moving. On your question, just briefly, I mean, the thing that we've had to, just from experience of having worked in Switzerland and very different environment from Ghana and Colombia, I think this orientation towards the policy and the politics of how decisions are made, what we're seeing is that we have, as researchers, we haven't been able to make that shift to a point where the translation process takes into account the politics. And the thing that we've been asked by internally as well, and now we're on board, is what are we willing to let go of? Meaning, you're going to have to let go of certain things, the purity of research, the quality of evidence. What is the thing that you're willing to live with in order for some version of evidence to make its way into the policy process? And that, frankly, has been a really hard conversation to have, because what does that really mean? And where do you set the boundaries around that? So anyway, I think that's a really important question of how do we actually build the science on the things that you were talking about. But go over.
So let me touch on two of the questions. The evidence, where do we find the evidence that we do? I can direct you to our website and it's right there. We've just had it upgraded. And to be honest, the education research coming out of Innocenti at the scale that it is now, this is a recent phenomena. This is in the past 4 or 5 years that we've really been working with countries doing this type of research. So really take a look at the website, it's quite manageable. But on a more serious note, it triggers the question for me on where do you find all of this at country level? That, I think, is a really interesting question and one that I don't know the answer to. And when I next get out on a trip, I am definitely going to be asking that question and seeing what answers we get back. On the other question about teachers, so I mentioned the type of research where we start with the administrative data and then dig deeper to see why is it saying that. We also have research that's embedded or being embedded into programs, some of which are at scale. We don't do RTIs or impact evaluations from the team that I lead. It's mixed methods, and we're asking the questions all the time. How is this for you? How is this working for you? Teachers are also part of that design process too, and children too. And that, of course, includes girls, boys, children with disabilities should be, if they are there. So making sure that we're really checking what's going on, what needs to change, what are we learning that can be shared. For me, having the evidence is a step in the research journey. It kind of doesn't end. You're always learning more.
Well, I'll just take the question directed at me, and thank you for that. Thanks for reminding me how long I've been doing this for as well. But you're wrong. It's actually 20 years. So really making me feel like I haven't made enough progress. But I am genuinely glad that you asked me that, because I was listening to myself earlier, thinking, God, I'm sounding negative. I really don't want to. And so your question is going to give me the chance to sound positive. So look. I think we have come an enormously long way. The first systematic review was probably in like 1970, mid-70s. It was on cardiovascular disease, right? And it was the first time anyone had ever thought to pull together a series of studies into a systematic review, right? And that really wasn't that long ago. And now they are not just in the health sector, they are absolutely everywhere. And if I asked most policymakers, they would have heard of systematic reviews. They might not be able to tell me whether a systematic review is better than a literature review, but we have made enormous progress, and that's particularly on the evidence generation side. So, you know, if you look at the smart buys, the extent to which we now have that efficacy bubble not nailed, but there's a whole set of policy interventions that any one of us could go and talk to policymakers about, and by and large, they would understand that comes with a degree of credibility, and by and large, they would understand, you know, your point about the different types of evidence, that was at least different in type to, you know, I visited a school last week and I saw some really interesting teacher training going on. So I think we have come a long way. I still think that the kind of BCure, the building capacity to use research evidence, there is just not enough of that. And there is not enough, as I said earlier, of we're quite good at, you know, I mean, I think back in the day, you know, research uptake was going to a conference. We've moved well beyond that now, but I'm not sure we've moved as far on the policy side, where evidence use is still seen as quite cherry picking, you know, instrumental. And I think I've done it for 20 years. I'm absolutely sure if I wanted to, there's still a job for me in 20 years' time. This is not going to be a quick fix. We're going to need to continue working on this, but it's worth it, and I enjoy it. So.
I want to pick up on the systematic review thing in response to kind of some of these questions. So about 5 years ago, I had just completed I managed a large impact evaluation contract at USAID, and I had just completed managing big 2-arm with control RCT in Ethiopia on a program we were funding under this evaluation contract. It was really well done, right? Lots of cooperation, lots of messiness with like 3 arms in Ethiopia, but and at the end we got, you know, a mildly positive effect size. But I was like, whoa, like 2 years, about $2 million, right? Most of that being the evaluation. And we got like 2 data points. And again, it was really well done. We had good information on fidelity. So I'm exaggerating a little bit. We had more than that, but it was kind of like, you know, really like, and the human effort, my own alone, right, that went into that and coordinating that was extraordinary. And then so I started thinking about like, okay, what do we do with all these, like, you know, $2 million, you've got like 1 dot on a league table, basically, right? Like on one of the systematic review tables. And so I actually did some math, like very, very simple math. And I took a couple of JPOW systematic reviews on education programs, and I very conservatively estimated $500,000 and they were all RCTs. So we know they're more than that, right? For the most part. So like, what was the cost, not the programs, what was the cost of the evaluations that went into that, those 20 programs that were included in the systematic review. And at that time, 3IE had done like the Uber, I don't know if you guys remember, it was like the Uber systematic review for education. It was like 300 and some odd studies, like it was. So I added that up, and it was like $2 billion. Just simple, again, conservative, simple, basic math, right? It was like $2 billion of investment in the evaluations. And there were literally 6 very broad points. Teacher capacity, it matters, right? You've got to train teachers well enough to improve instructional quality. Kids, like it was, I'm actually not exaggerating. There were like 6 findings and it was like, wow, and again, beautifully done. The team's super committed, like huge ambitious effort, like hats off, right, to everybody involved. But that is, and then the other thing that occurred to me with this, and this was more from the USA perspective, is like these systematic reviews and evidence reviews become products and they become static, right? So like think about that investment that 3IE made to build up, right, all into to harmonize and to like look at all of the different elements of those and build up to those conclusions. Why isn't that a living, breathing thing? And then why don't we have contextual variables and metadata? Because the metadata are there, whether they're in the report or not, but we have metadata about the context, the timing, the population, right? We have all that information. So why don't we have like these metadata tags on all of these impact evaluations so that you can kind of build it up and look at it in a more kind of comparable or generalizable way or more context specific way, and move away from having these products, these like branded, kind of institutional, right, products that just are capped off when they're done. And so I think that's, it's structural issues, it's funding, it's the tragedy of the commons, all of those things go into that. But it would be amazing if we could think about ways to move past like, the evidence synthesis we're doing now and having something that's a little bit more long-term and strategic. And then I just had one other point. I was trying to find some evidence and data for a study design I was doing that I wanted to include like social network and informal influences and all of that in the measurement domains of a middle tier study. And I had the fortune that, like network to call up Bram Flesch in South Africa and to, he connected me to John Daly in California, does amazing work on social network analysis and stuff. And so, bounced to Pinky back in South Africa and all of that. But, that's really, to your point, where do you get your evidence, right? And ESSA, Lucy, like, hey, who's doing like great work on this stuff? And it shouldn't depend on that. It's a very elitist, and it keeps the same group in, and it keeps the same kind of those nodes like very close in a very elite circle of like who has information, to what. So that's kind of what I end up doing, because there's so much publication bias that you have to go out, in the major publications. But I had that opportunity and most people don't. So yeah.
So Christine had my job before, and she just told you that she wished they had invested in meta standards, and now I get to do it.
Well, I did that, and I don't know why you didn't do it.
No, you teed it up.
I just thought about it.
Well, hey, you thought about it back then, but that is, to Donica's point, like USAID is too big to say we're going to curate the evidence and say this is what we should all look at. Very decentralized, very many layers. So centrally, what we can focus on is the piping, right? Do people have access to the right information? Can we tag things? Are they easily accessible? So we're all sharing the same language. And then how do we empower those decision makers, whether it's a USAID education officer, whether it's an implementing partner writing a proposal in a country, whether it's the ministry saying, what is the latest on X? How do we empower them with the skills to actually come to the evidence and the tools to really know, like, what are you getting? What should you take from it? And what level of confidence should you have on this evidence? So I think that for us, we can't go to a single place, but we can really we can really empower everyone with the skills and the tools. and I will finish your job, Christine, I promise.
No pressure. We'll come back to. And just a comment from the kind of emerging what works perspective is, and I think that Christine, you also posed a great challenge, which is to make sure that this lives and breathes and continues. That is our aspiration. So we don't want this to end in 6 to 8 years, even though that's the course of the hub funding. We are thinking, how does this continue beyond, for the next kind of foreseeable future, continue to get updated and sync with what's there. We're grateful actually that we're building on RISE, so there's continuity in that sense. And I think what we're hearing is that there needs to be continuity, that it takes time, that it takes flexibility. And so we're keen to plug into existing efforts on synthesis and data that exists and try to connect to that and link into it and amplify to the extent that's possible. I think one of the other things that we have a potentially unique opportunity to do is that we have this combination of synthesis and uptake and evidence generation. And so some of our earliest products will be synthesis because we haven't generated the new evidence just yet. And so they'll kind of take stock of what's happened. And that will be some of the stuff that comes out soonest in the course of the hub. But then over the course of the hub, we're trying to influence the type of evidence that is being generated, and the how and the who as well. And that should enter the next synthesis. And so hopefully the first syntheses look different from the later syntheses. So hold us accountable to that. So that's a take on that. Okay, one more round of questions. Yes, over here. Yeah, right here. Okay, and then we can come back.
Yep. Hi, I'm Barbara Tournier from IIEP UNESCO. I was just reflecting on what you were saying about the timing of the release of the evidence. And I was thinking what this means for us at IIEP as we, accompany ministries to do their education sector analysis and their education sector plans. And there's this stage where we guide them in the policy formulation process. And so you have this window of opportunity there. And it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. I'm just thinking that we should better use that window of opportunity to take the time that's necessary at this stage to create the space for dialogue between the team that's working on the policy formulation and inviting people who have recently come up with new evidence that is locally generated and to inform and get that dialogue going at that stage. And then that would probably mean that you have a better chance of uptake, maybe.
Yeah, and so we'll be knocking on your door, IEP, to see if that's happening. Thank you. Yeah, right here. Yeah.
Hi, Anne from the Fund for Innovation and Development. My question is how you're thinking about AI as a potential game changer in evidence dissemination and creating knowledge on knowledge, as we were discussing on Tuesday. So yeah, curious to hear about this.
Hi, my name is Sabina. I'm from FCDO. So we're obviously here in lovely, rainy Oxford, and it's great to be here all together. But I think we can all agree where we really need the evidence uptake to take place is at the country level. And I think lots of people here will have been involved in trying to do that. And I'm really interested in thoughts on what we can do to strengthen the local architecture to improve evidence uptake. So it's kind of linked to some of Barbara's points, but I think lots of us will have sat in local education groups, been trying to influence sector plans, but quite often the different development partners are all pushing slightly different agendas. FCGO might be saying, please do foundational learning. Another donor might be pushing school feeding or something else. And sometimes we can kind of go against each other. And then even the government themselves, they've got different incentives about what they're pushing, and civil society maybe not effectively represented or not given the space to push for evidence-based interventions too. So really interested in thoughts on that, and also whether the What Works Hub can look into this a bit more and see what we can do to strengthen that local architecture. Thanks.
Yeah, my question is actually very related, so I'll keep it short. But when we talk about evidence uptake and use, a lot of the time we talk about this through a framework of telling, so kind of finding the right context to share the evidence to impact the right policy. But we know that it's very dependent on policy windows and windows of opportunity, and that can often be very dependent on relationships and being able to frame the evidence in a way that's speaking to the immediate needs and incentives of the people you're talking to. And often the people who hold the evidence might not be the most influential people in the room based on these incentive structures. And so can you talk a little bit about, in your experiences, the role of listening and that softer kind of push and pull of the relational side of evidence uptake? And I'm Maddie from JPO. Thanks.
Take a couple more. Okay, yeah, over here, if you can get into the middle there. Yes, this gentleman. We have a single mic, I think, so this is taking some coordination. Yes. Thank you. Oh, convergence in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Eric Opoku from Right to Play. My question is to the panel. I'm looking at some of the comments we made about meaningful and timely evidence and linking that to whose evidence matter. How are donors on this panel thinking about that with respect to also the localization agenda? On which evidence do we uptake? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Maria in the back there.
Maria Brendelmeyer with B Square and the GIP. I'm also wondering if there's something that we need to do about the type of evidence that gets generated through research, because from a researcher's perspective, sometimes the priority is how can I do something that gets published? And I'm thinking back at what Christine said about all the things that are available. How can we make sure that the topics that the government is interested is actually also something that the researchers will be interested in? I mean, funders obviously play a big role, but there may also be other things.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so let's bring it back to the panel, and I'll request if it's possible to try to make your answer 1 minute, because I have one more question for everyone. And then that should bring us to the end. So maybe we'll go reverse order. So Hetal, and pick one of your favorite questions or that resonates.
I actually want to hand the mic to Rebecca Pagel, because I think the question, are you in the room, Rebecca?
You can channel her spirit.
Okay, I'm going to channel her spirit. Because the question on localization, who's
There she is. Yeah.
You were listening outside. The question, Rebecca, was on localization and whose evidence matters and what are we doing about bringing local evidence up?
And we're doing 1 minute per person.
1 minute.
Gosh, okay, I'm sorry. I ran in here and I'm getting over pneumonia. So, yeah, so we really have recognized at USAID that, we are really committed to things like randomized control trials, that there is a lot of evidence out there that we're excluding if we only look at those. So we're really trying to think about what are the different types of evidence that are useful in the education sector and how do we access those? And a lot of that is thinking about at the local level, who is producing what, how can we fund them to synthesize the data and evidence that's available to them, and to disseminate it in ways that are useful and usable.
Thank you. Very impressive. Thank you. Christine, yeah.
Sabina's question.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite ones. So I think think about the context of a typical development context where you have a lot of bilaterally, like big bilaterally funded. USA comes in with a $80 million program, and DFID's in there with their $50 million program. And you see, and the GPE and the bank, and where we know what that looks like. And you see these like massive, I don't want to necessarily call them swings, but there are swings between these like mechanisms that happen. And one thing I've noticed, I've done quite a bit of work in South Africa and really just like admired, right, what the DBE and their research team does and just in general from policy. And they have this like steady march, right? They've got 10 years they've done the different EGRP studies, right? They've got academics that work with them consistently in South Africa. And I know there's some, there's good institutions there and all of that. But I really think some of it's because they're not subject, if you will, to these big development projects that come in and swing, right? They're doing most of the funding of their own. They have a lot of development partners, but they coordinate them and they work in service of the DBE's like policy, their research, their mission. And that is not what you see in most countries, right? Where there's just these incredible swings and you've got these 5-year cycles that can be very disruptive. All everybody's different 5-year cycles at different times and different priorities. And so I actually think that what you see is a structural development assistance issue I don't know how to solve it, but like that's kind of what I've seen, and I think we need to pay attention to that. And it goes to the research agenda as well, right? So it's not just the program interventions.
Yeah. Nathaniel? Oh, or Linda, yeah, go ahead.
Just on two very quick points. On the localization agenda, I mean, the research we do from the administrative data, that is local data. You know, it's us that are getting the permissions to access that data and utilize that data. And we work closely with people within the government institutions because it's analysis that the governments can do. You taking that further and looking at the why it shows this as well. Again, analysis that the government and the local authorities can do, and that's why we work so closely together on that. And with the stuff embedded in programs, we again really try to stick to the administrative data or the data that's being collected anyway, as much as possible, because therein lies sustainability and in the approach. We are also hiring, thanks to the What Works Hub, a few people to be based very strategically in regions to tackle some of the issues around collaboration and about sharing of best practices, best evidence that we have through the research that we have for the key moments mentioned before.
Nathaniel?
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to emphasize the point on relationships and listening. I do think that's, and it links to a lot of the other questions around localization, local donor coherence. I think, and it goes back to this point about window of opportunity as well, actually. And I think I sort of see it less as a sort of window of opportunity, research program by research program, but within a sector, you know, as funders, how can we support those local partnerships to grow more where there is a very close working relationship within the sector with practitioner, with these sort of last mile practitioners and policymakers? Because I just think it's too unrealistic to hope that, you know, the policy intervention is going to be needed at the time that the specific research study is finished. And anyway, it's probably not really desirable. We do want policymakers, practitioners to be basing the decisions around bodies of evidence. So I just think the more we can build those relationships, the better. And then just linking that to the country coherence point, I think it's the same thing, right? The country coherence needs to come from the country. It's, you know, whenever I've worked overseas and seen donors try to impose a structure themselves on the country, it's just too hard. You need a plan that's led by the country, and that's really, if you can get those relationships in the country, and if that can be led by evidence, then everyone can get behind that. Yeah.
I mean, I would just ask you maybe a question, frame my answer as a question, is like, what's the ultimate goal? I think, and at least in our view, is how do you create systems that are continuously interrogating and learning? That's the whole, it's the curiosity, whereas Rukmini that she was talking about. How do we create systems that do that continuously as part of their fabric, as part of their DNA? Many of you are doing that at the institutional level, the A/B testing. That's an expression of that curiosity-driven mindset. We want to see systems that do that. How do we build those systems? And this is more complicated than the minute or 30 seconds that I have to answer that question. But we do, I think that's the challenge we had ahead of ourselves. We think that the Ed Labs is one promising model of seeding the culture of evidence. This is not about great one research study or 5 or 10 or 100. This is about the culture of continuous interrogation and learning. And that's the piece that I think we'll have to always think about and orient ourselves towards.
So I don't know if folks remember one of the statements that I put up in the opening remarks was execution eats strategy for breakfast, but there's another version of that, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. So it depends if you want culture or execution, but both eat strategy for breakfast. So I think that's another good reminder of that. And someone actually once asked me, when does the learning stop? When have you learned enough? And I said, never, never. We always keep learning. Not satisfying, but hopefully true. Okay, we have a minute left for each person. So I'm going to request some homework again, because this is the last panel for the conference of the Hub before closing. So we are at the beginning of the Hub's journey. And so if you had to make an ask of the Hub in a minute, And in the end of the 6 years to 8 years, though we will continue after that, but if in the 6 to 8 years we arrive there, so give us an ask that we can benchmark towards and then come back to in the 6 to 8 years. So Heta.
I think I started with this, what works for whom, right? We've made so much progress making sure that we're reaching all children. All the agencies up here and many of you have spent years making sure that we're thinking about children with all different needs, different learning abilities, that they get access, that they're reached, that we're designing for them. So I would just really, really, really encourage us, let's not step backwards, and let's make sure all the research that you do does speak to who benefits, do the gaps close, and if they don't close, then what can we do to keep closing them? So let's not let the average kind of mask what might be happening underneath.
Thank you. Christine?
I think improve our collective ability to understand and interpret the generalizability and the comparability of evidence, including cost evidence.
Okay. We can do that. Let's try. Yes, Nathaniel.
Yeah, I've got one, but I really like cost. I'm going to say.
Alright.
No, so I think, you know, for me, and I've said this a lot now, but I will say it again. I think it's about the transparency of policymaking process. So I think by the end, if we can understand more about and have tangible examples of the processes and incentives that force transparency and honesty in policymaking, then I think we'll be there. And I like Donica's example of EdLabs. I think, you know, EdLabs is one of those examples that can be that sort of systemic thing.
I think mine is about collaboration. If in 6 years' time we can see real evidence of collaboration and synergies and building on other people's research, recognizing that there is space for multitude types of research in a space, but really that collaboration between us all, if there's solid evidence of that in 6 years' time, that would be great.
So we'll measure if we're collaborating. We'll have to bring some evidence to bear on that.
Thank you. Indicator?
Yes, yes.
Small
Mel
scale
people,
job.
we're looking at
Scale
you.
somewhere.
Yes, exactly. Donica.
Yeah, well, I think some combo of this is also keep us honest as funders and tell us when we shouldn't be doing things and make us work together. And also, I think, question your own work all the time. Would we have known many of the things, like, if we didn't have all this research today, like, was that all necessary? Was it all needed? Well, I mean, not, I think this is all amazing work. I'm not saying that it shouldn't have been done, but questioning always, why are we doing what we're doing? And are we repeating some of what Christine was talking about? Or did we learn anything new?
And Nathaniel seems on the edge of his seat, so yes. Okay.
In 6 years' time, I mean, as beautiful as this is, if we were like somewhere completely different, like in Rwanda or, you know, Delhi or somewhere, and this was like 90% policymakers. And look, we've come, you know, this question about where we've come from, I love the mix we've got at this event. Yeah. But, you know, I think that shift would be good.
Yeah, okay, very concrete. And we will reflect on that and aspire to that. And I think that's definitely possible. So great, so here we are. Just first of all, a big round of applause. Thank you to the panel. If I can also say a big round of applause to everyone here. Thank you everyone for coming, for contributing, for questioning. And I would just actually pick up on, as I close, I think we've highlighted challenges, but I am also feeling a sense of possibility and optimism because there is such a strong commitment to the evidence and to the evidence uptake process. As messy as it is, there is a commitment here to do it more, engage in the mess, try to make it a little more systematic over time, and see it through over the long haul. So inspired by this community. And actually to pick up on something you started it with, Hetal, it is amazing that so much of this is actually to just make those minutes in the classroom as magical as possible. And what an elaborate architecture there is to make that happen in government systems, in schools, in the donor architecture. But it's really about making those minutes in the classroom really good. And so just reminding ourselves of that and really centering it on those classroom moments. And obviously the whole system needs to happen to make that happen, but in service of that. And the learning crisis persists. So we're a long ways away from success. It's hard, it's stubborn, but if we're focused on those minutes in the classroom being really good, hopefully we make it done. So big thank you to the panel. And with that, I will hand over to the closing to Claire and Cleo. So big thank you. Yes.
So we're almost done.
Yeah.
To help us reflect on what we've been doing, the journey we've been through over the last few days. And the first speaker is Cleo.
Right here.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah.
We switch over to Cleo's slides, please. So Cleo is speaking on behalf of being one of the funders of the hub.
So I have two things to say. The first is thanking all of you for an exciting couple of days, and then I'll leave you with 3 questions. So I love slides, that's why. So the first is to celebrate, because there are a few things that were really exciting about the last days. The first is good news. I think we've heard about concrete interventions that work and are feasible at scale. So we've heard from Akashi on the UP and MP, really promising results around structured pedagogy. We've heard about the Malawi results. I see Ariana here, who is always realistic, but we've seen overall that progress is possible. And so concretely what it means is that, the epiphany that Armando was mentioning earlier about a child, connecting their reading skills with what they actually experience in their reading life, in their daily life, is happening, at scale more and more. So this is great news. The second is, I don't know if some of you have read this recent paper by Amy Jo Dowd. It's called Everyone is Speaking About It, but Nobody is Doing It. And it speaks about implementation research. And I think the exciting thing about this last couple of days is that actually some people here are doing it, right? And this is pretty unique, pretty new, as I think Laura Savage was saying. We've had, for me, 8 years, but for other 10 years of coming to this room and speaking about research. And I think this is a genuine change. So things are changing, and this is exciting. There's, of course, the rigorous research on large-scale government reform, and very much looking forward to hearing from this in a few years. And then I have to say, I had a personal favorite panel yesterday with Mpumi Chepi, the government representative from Ghana and Tanzania. Yes. And I even put some quotes I enjoyed. I have more. But so it was great to essentially hear from government and civil society. So I don't know a better way to summarize the last few days than by quoting another American philosopher. So Taylor Swift, nothing lasts forever, but this is getting good now. So this is getting good. Then I also have 3 questions, because Noam asked people for homework, that have remained on my mind, that were actually raised by others mostly, but have stayed on my mind during these last couple of days. The first one are on this magical minutes in the classroom, Noam was mentioning. A couple of people asked over the last couple of days, do we have a shared understanding of what good looks like in the classroom? These pictures are courtesy of Ared. Mamadou is over here. Thank you. And essentially, I put them here to remind us about the kind of classroom change we're looking for. So the first one is children reading in pair in a soft voice, tracking the text with the finger, eyes on text. The second is a boy solving a math exercise. And there are obviously other things that goes into effective teaching, but this shift from teaching on the board to spending more time on independent practice, the you-do part of I do, we do, you do, is one of them. And it's actually not easy to achieve given the stroke and talk model of teaching is so deeply ingrained. I think there was also a pattern of the community of practice day. So for me, essentially, implementers can learn from evidence, and they do, as the last couple of days showed. But the opposite is also true. Good research should be informed by implementation and classroom practices. And I really like the quote from Claire from Youth Impact. We get most of our best ideas from the implementers. This slide is complicated, but I'll go through it fast. Because I think the second question is, do we know enough about how to get there, right? Because the changes in practices rely on their coherent reinforcement through multiple channels. And at the core, the existential issue is that teachers have limited touch points with other professionals and limited support. So the three in the middle are probably quite important. You know, do they use the structured material? This is essential because that's the only thing that supports practice on a day-to-day basis. However, we don't have a good sense actually of how to drive the use of these guides by the average teachers. The other, training, the limited training they received, should be as efficient as possible and focused on modeling good practice. So we do need, and actually we do need more evaluated examples of how to do this well. Third, because this instructional support is so limited, Mpumi, Vanessa, Francis, Stephen come from South Africa. I mean, what's the ratio of district officers that go to schools to school in South Africa? 1 to 200 or? Yeah, so someone else was 1 to 400. So it's not possible to think that effective instructional support will happen this way, and we need innovative models to focus more on the lagging school to optimize this instructional support better. And finally, above the level of the coach, you also need to move from an engagement focus on compliance and accountability to reviewing and acting on classroom-based observation data. That one was very well also documented at RISE. So I'll get out of my soapbox. But there are many targeted implementation research questions on how to drive this teacher change of practice that are on the immediate pathway to classroom instruction. Some of them were addressed in the past couple of days, but of course there's many more, much more to do. And the last and final question is, okay, what does all this mean for how we think about scale and institutionalization? And as a funder, I hear often, I have this great intervention, but that relies on a model of 1 coach to 10 schools. Or I have this great intervention in this small country in West Africa that has great results, but costs $300 per student. And we probably need to stop that. Because we need to think about models that can start from that can scale from the start. And it still happens too often that we produce nice results for expensive pilots that will never scale. And this shift to a minimal component mindset is important. And finally, the next big question, the final big question is around, the fact that probably a lot of the results we're seeing now rely on aid injection in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. And so there's probably a need to also think about what are the core tasks that you need to mainstream at the district and sub-district level to support ongoing instructional support. And finally, I think Judith mentioned this point, what are the actual costs and marginal costs, one-off and long-term to mainstreaming these instructional practices in the system, structured pedagogy and DARL in particular. So that's all to say. I'm excited about the few years ahead and about continuing to learn from the great research and implementation research that the WhatWorks Hub is putting together. And beyond WhatWorks Hub, and I will see you all next year. And I'll pass on to Claire.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Don't panic, I have no slides. I will let you go soon. I just want to make just a few final remarks. So first, although we have been coming to this room on and off over a large number of years, this is really the first conference of the Hub proper. And Noam and I, when we were discussing it way back when, we thought, well, this will be agenda setting. We'll try and get people on board. But actually, the thing that's really struck me over the past 2 days, in fact, with the pre-day we had as well, there is an agenda. I think people are on board across researchers, across practitioners, across those in government. So that's fantastic, but clearly there's work for us to all do. And we've taken on board all of your comments. Thank you along the way, all of the comments about what the Hub should be doing. I mean, just a couple that have really struck me is where's government? And that's partly a reflection of the fact that this is the first conference. We deliberately chose not to reach out to that many government participants. I was very keen that Hadja would join, but we haven't reached out to government representatives from all of our countries. That was a choice for the first conference. We will, and it was it was mentioned by Nathaniel. You want us to get up to 90%. I don't know if we're going to do 90%. Okay, but maybe we won't go to 90 next year, but you know, we very much hope to, and that's on the way. We also, just coming back to your other comment about wouldn't it be great to be in Rwanda, we've been talking about being in other countries. I'm not sure Leo's gone. We wasn't clear whether it was going to be Rwanda next year, but we very much hope to do so at some point. It may be Ghana next year, but we hope to move the conference around. And another question, are we thinking about enough about things like inclusion, social and emotional learning and so forth? There are many things we didn't get chance, you know, to put on the programme this year, and we will definitely come back to them. We're taking your comments as formative feedback, and we very much hope to bring that into the programme next year. Okay, that's it in terms of my reflections on the conference, but I have got thank yous to do. What you might have noticed is there's just an enormous number of people who have been involved in organising this conference. You've probably interacted with many different people over you know, the last 2 days and in coming here. The people I want to name check specifically are Mihaela, Yi, Chenge, Lisa, Emily, Lucy, Luca, and Katie Katie Cooper, who many of you will remember from before. They've all been fantastic. Thank you. We will show our appreciation to them. We've promised to take them to the pub and have a proper pub night together, and we will do that. And also to all the hub staff, of whom there are many, many more, and I'm not going to name all of them, who've stepped in and volunteered and helped out over the 2 days. And in particular, to name, it's been his baby. He's cared passionately about it, and I think, like, join me in thanking him for having the ambition to put this on. So thank you.